Hello and welcome to this quick guide on creating a furnace. If you wanted to make a fire that burns through things and maybe runs out, then this is the right quick guide for you. To start with, let's see what I have in mind. So I'm going to interact with this hole over here. It's going to take the item that I was holding in my hand out of the inventory, turn on a load of fire effects, some smoke, some sounds, some animations, burn through that, and then when the fuel runs out, essentially turn all of those effects off. So we have a fire that feels like it's burning through something, and then when it doesn't have anything there, it doesn't do anything. Let's investigate how we do that. So to start with, if I wanted to interact with a hole in a wall, that's actually quite tricky because by interacting, you're actually wanting to interact with whatever is under your crosshair, and under the player's crosshair when they're interacting with the hole in the wall is actually whatever's behind that. So to start with, I added an aircon unit and then made it invisible. Attached to the aircon unit is a fire script. Within my fire script, the steps I went through was firstly to create two arrays. One to hold all of the effects, the other to hold all of the sounds. And you can see those two arrays here in the entity editor. They essentially cover all of the different fire effects that I wanted to use and all of the different fiery type sounds that I wanted to use. Once I had those two arrays, I created a function called add fuel. And within that function, I loop through both of those arrays and turn on all of the effects and all of the sounds. I also created a corresponding function called stop fire, where I looped through them again but turned them all off. Then I hooked up the onInteract function to the add fuel function. So with the invisible aircon unit selected, I went to the onInteract event and hooked it up to the fire script, which is attached to the same aircon unit, and the add fuel event. I also ran the stop fire event or stop fire function from the init function, which is fired as soon as the game starts. So when the game starts, it stops all the fire. Now I could have gone through and deselected active or made them all inactive in the entity editor, but having the stop fire and add fuel corresponding functions is really useful further down the line. Once we did that, the next thing to look at was somehow taking whatever the player was holding and burning it. The way we did that was essentially when you have an onInteract event and you fire a function from that, you can actually capture whoever just interacted with the thing. So in this case, player one interacts with the fire, and then I can capture player one by putting an argument in between these two brackets, and that will then store that player one. To take something out of their inventory, you need to get hold of the user by doing player get user and then dot inventory script. So that gets the inventory script that's attached to that user, and then use the remove current to remove whatever the user is currently holding. This function is here, this remove current. And essentially it removes one of, or however many of the things they are currently holding. I pass in the number 1 to specify how many things I want to remove. Once that function is run, it essentially takes something out of their hands, but that can still, you can still start a fire regardless of whether you have something in your hands or not. And so what we needed to do was capture whatever the result of that was. So local had fuel captures whatever the result of this function call is. And then it checks it. If that was true or an entity of some kind, then it will be able to run these to turn on the effects and the sounds. If that function returns false or nil or something that's or null or whatever, then this if statement will be false and it won't run and the fire won't start. So this is our way of essentially requiring something, anything from the user, and then before we actually run the fire. So by requiring something from the user and removing it from their inventory, it feels like they've thrown it on the fire, even though behind the scenes no one's actually thrown anything on the fire. We've just removed something from their inventory and started a bunch of effects. The final part of this is the timer part, so where it feels like the fire has burnt out. So in order to do that, I created a couple of new properties. One was burn rate, which was the amount of fuel to burn per second as a number, and the max fuel, which was the total amount of fuel that our fire can take. When we add fuel, so going back to our add fuel function, we're now modeling the fire using numbers behind the scenes. So we're not actually having a real fire that's burning, and it's not necessarily super accurate, but essentially we are just numerically trying to emulate a fire. So at the start we have self.current fuel. So when the game starts, self.current fuel, we set that to 0. So there is no fuel in the fire and the fire is not on. So that's what those two lines of code do. And then when we have checked that we've got something in our inventory and removed it, we're at this point, and the player has interacted with the fire, so they've thrown something on the fire, we then set the current fuel level to max fuel. So we've given the fire as much fuel as it could possibly need. From that point, if we go down to this onTick function here, so onTick is run every single frame in Crayta. It's called from Crayta, and when it's called, there is a number that's passed into delta time. So between these two brackets, if you put the word delta time in there or a variable name, you can capture how many seconds has passed since the last tick event. And it's likely to be a number that's very small, 0.03, something like that, depending on your frame rate or the frame rate of the client. So onTick delta time, and then we check, have we got any fuel? If self.current fuel is greater than 0, then, and then we reduce the amount of fuel we have by the burn rate times delta time. And that's what that line of code does. If our current fuel falls below 0, then stop the fire. So here in add fuel, we're setting our current fuel to max fuel, which means that current fuel is greater than 0. And so this will run every frame until we run out of fuel. And then when fuel is less than 0, we stop fire. The next frame, self.current fuel, that's not greater than 0 anymore. And therefore, this is false, and this code won't run here. That won't run. So there we go. So we're essentially starting our fire with and adding some numbers into our current fuel, and then reduce that number a little bit every single frame. And then we stop the fire when that number is below 0. Finally, I hooked in a couple of events so that it's possible to hook this fire up to different parts of the game, however you want to do that. So on fire started, when we add fuel, if the user has something in their inventory to put on the fire, we check, is there any fuel in the fire at the moment? Because if there isn't, we're actually starting that fire. And then we can send the on fire started event. If we run out of fuel, so when we run out of fuel in this onTick event here, we've got this self stop fire. And within the stop fire function, I've actually put the on fire stopped event and send there. So we've got on fire started and on fire stopped. And to showcase this in action, I just hooked this up to an active animation script on the industrial bellows, so that the bellows work when you interact. When you interact with the fire, the bellows start, and when the fire runs out, the bellows stop. And that's essentially it. So I will make this furnace accessible through by turning it into a package, and we can see the fire in action, and there we go, there's the bellows. I've left the aircon unit on visible, but that's okay. You can still see the smoke coming out the chimney, and the bellows are working. And that's it. That's a quick guide on how to create a furnace and script one in Crayta.